Buford Crossing, Dakota Territory, March 1887. The mud that spring was not ordinary mud. It was the kind of mud that had opinions about where you were going and intended to be part of the conversation. It pulled at wagon wheels with the deliberate patience of something that had been waiting all winter for the chance, and it held on with a grip that suggested it did not consider the arrangement temporary. The road into Buford Crossing, such as it was, had dissolved sometime in February into a long brown argument between the wagon and the earth was winning. Etta Solvang was 63 years old, and she had seen mud before. She had seen Minnesota mud and Wisconsin mud and the particular gray mud of river bottoms that smells of iron and old water. But Dakota mud in March was different. It had ambition. She sat in the wagon and watched her son-in-law, Arvad, work the wheels free with a shovel the same way he had worked them free 17 times in the past 4 miles. And she noticed things the way she had always noticed things, quietly, completely, without announcing herself. She noticed how Arvid's shoulders moved differently than they had at the start of the journey, how his breath came harder than the work required, how he paused between efforts with the shovel resting against his thigh and looked at the horizon with an expression she recognized, but could not name the expression of a man measuring the distance between where he is and where he needs to be, and finding the number larger than he expected. Her daughter Sigrid sat beside her holding Stellan against her coat. The boy was 8 years old and had been asleep for the last hour despite the lurching and the cold, because children that age can sleep through anything that isn't aimed directly at them. Sigrid was 36 and had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, and she was watching Arvid work with the particular quality of attention that wives give to husbands they are worried about, but have promised themselves they will not mention it yet. Etta said nothing. She looked at the land. 160 acres at the confluence of 2 rivers, purchased sight unseen from a letter written by a man who had wanted to believe it was worth more than it was. What Etta saw from the wagon seat was clay bluffs rising to the south, a grass flat that had gone the color of old rope in the winter cold, and a structure near the base of the nearest bluff that might generously be called a sod house if you were standing far enough away to miss the details. She had made this journey because Sigrid had asked her to come, and she had come because Sigrid was her daughter, and because the alternative was remaining in Minnesota in the house where Etta's husband had died 4 years prior, which was a house she had loved for a long time and had since been unable to enter without the specific grief of rooms that remember the people they've lost. So she had come. She had not expected it to be easy. April on the claim was work without end. Arvid worked from first light until the light was gone, and sometimes after by lantern when there was lantern oil. He broke the hard clay with a mattock, turned it, broke it again. He patched the sod house roof where the winter had left gaps large enough for a man's fist to pass through. He cut timber from the creek bottom and hauled it one load at a time to reinforce the walls. He worked in the rain when the rain came, which it did in April, with the persistence of something that had not gotten sufficient rain in March and was making up for lost time. He worked in his coat, then in his coat and his second shirt, then in everything he owned, layered one on top of the other, and still the cold found him. Etta watched. She watched the way she had always watched the people she cared about, not to interfere, not to offer opinions they had not requested. But because watching carefully was how she understood what was happening before it became the kind of thing that announced itself, she watched Arvid's cough start as a clearing of the throat, then as a morning ritual, then as something that stopped him mid-motion and bent him forward over his shovel with a sound like wet cloth tearing. She watched the color leave his face over the course of 3 weeks, the particular leaving of color that is not pallor, but subtraction, as if something inside is spending what the surface cannot afford to spend. She said nothing, not because she did not know what she was seeing, because knowing and saying are different things, and saying too early changes only the knowing of the other person without changing the thing itself. Arvid died in May. He made it to May, which was more than some men would have made. He had finished the roof patching and started the root cellar and gotten 12 acres turned before his lungs stopped cooperating with the rest of him. He was buried on the bluff behind the property next to a wooden marker that said the name of a man Etta had never met, some previous occupant who had discovered the same thing Arvid discovered, which was that the Dakota clay gives back very little of what you put into it. Sigrid did not rise from bed for 6 weeks, not dramatically, not in the way of stories where grief performs itself for an audience, just quietly the way a lamp dims when the oil runs low, Not all at once, just steadily, less present, less there, until the difference between waking and sleeping became too small to measure. Etta tended the claim. She fed Stellan. She sat with Sigrid in the evenings and said very little because silence was more honest than the words she could have offered. She counted what remained. $4.30, 60 pounds of flour, 2 cords of green cottonwood that Arvid had cut in March green enough to smoke more than it burned, which was firewood, in the way that rain is water, technically accurate, functionally insufficient. She counted the weeks to winter. 10. She walked the property every morning the way she had walked properties her entire life, slowly with her hands free and her attention on the ground rather than the horizon because the ground is where the information is. She looked at the clay. She looked at the bluffs. She looked at the sod house with its repaired roof and its gaps that a determined wind could find without much effort, and she did the arithmetic that the situation required. The arithmetic did not work. The general store in Buford Crossing occupied the center of the settlement, the way the sun occupies the center of a solar system, not because it was the largest thing, but because everything else organized itself in relation to it. Cormac Brandt owned the store and therefore owned in the informal economy of opinion that governs small settlements, something close to the community's understanding of what was possible and what was not. He was 57 years old, broad through the chest in the way of men who have worked outside their entire lives and have the bone density to show for it. He had survived 11 Dakota winters, which in this territory was a credential that outweighed most others. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite in the hard winter of 1881, when the trains stopped running for 5 months and people burned their furniture to stay alive. The missing fingers were not something he mentioned often. They were something people noticed and did not ask about, which was its own kind of authority. When Cormac Brandt said something about winter survival in Dakota Territory, people wrote it down. Etta walked the 3 miles to the store on a morning in August, when the heat was the kind of heat that makes the distance between 2 points seem longer than the map suggests. She wore her good dress, which still showed the mud stains from Arvid's funeral, despite her best efforts with soap and water because the mud of that particular day had decided to be permanent. She waited until the other customers left. Then she approached the counter. Brandt looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man who has already assessed the situation from the corner of his eye and is now confirming his assessment with a direct look. She told him what she needed: flour salt, salt pork beans, lamp oil, and timber for roof repair. She told him she could pay after next year's crop. She told him she could hire out to neighboring farms through harvest if labor was worth more than credit to him. Brandt set down his pen. He did not look at his ledger. The numbers were already in his head. A Dakota winter requires 8 cords of firewood at minimum, he said. Your place has gaps in the walls, which means you'd need 10. You have 2 cords green cottonwood, which will smoke more than it burns. He paused. You need 400 pounds of flour. You have approximately 60, 100 pounds of salt. You have perhaps 20. He looked at her with the direct, unsentimental attention of a man delivering a diagnosis he has delivered before. Your son-in-law was a capable man. He didn't finish the roof. He didn't store enough wood. He didn't get the crop planted. A woman of your age cannot do what a capable man couldn't finish. Etta stood with her hands at her sides and said, Then what am I supposed to do? It was not a question exactly. It was a request for information she had already concluded he would not have. Send your daughter and the boy to the church in Bismarck, he said. They take charity cases. The church there is good about it. He opened his ledger again. As for yourself, find a family that needs help through winter. You're strong enough for that kind of work still, I'd say. He said this without cruelty and without particular kindness, the way a physician says a difficult thing when he believes the difficulty of the saying is less important than the clarity of the information. This claim is finished, he said. If you stay here, all 3 of you will not make it through March. Etta stood at the counter for a moment. The store was empty. No one to witness her shame. If it was shame, she was not entirely certain what she felt, which was itself information. She had expected this. Not these exact words, but this had Buck's shape. She had walked 3 miles to confirm what the arithmetic had already told her. I'm not putting my family on a charity stage, she said. Brandt shrugged, not unkindly. Then the ground will have them in the spring, he said. Makes no difference to what the winter is going to do. She walked the 3 miles home in the August heat, counting her steps the way she had always counted things when she did not want to count something else. 8 cords of firewood, 400 pounds of flour, 10 weeks, $4.30. The numbers moved through her mind like a wheel that wouldn't stop her name. Must stop turning, going around and arriving at the same place every time. She was not crying, she was thinking. Her husband's brother had filed a claim 2 miles north before abandoning it the previous spring. The letter that had brought Arvid and Sigrid to Dakota had come from this man. Optimistic letters, the kind written by people who believe that describing a thing warmly enough will make it warm. He was gone now. The claim sat empty. Etta walked there on a morning in late August, hoping to find tools, timber, anything that could be salvaged. The path took her up a rise where the clay bluffs gave way to rolling grassland, and coming down the other side, she found what she had not expected to find. A prairie dog town. It stretched across the flat ground for perhaps 200 yards in every direction, hundreds of mounds, some low and flat to the ground, some built up into steep-sided cones that rose 2 and 3 feet from the surface. The animals themselves moved through the landscape like living punctuation popping up and down from their burrows, their bark chirps carrying across the quiet air in overlapping waves. The temperature was pushing 90 degrees. Etta sat down in the thin shade of a cottonwood at the edge of the colony and rested because 3 miles in August, heat at 63 years old, requires resting when resting is available. She drank water from the canteen she had carried and looked at the prairie dogs. She had intended to rest for a few minutes. She stayed for 2 hours. What kept her there was not the animals themselves, but the pattern she began to notice after the first 20 minutes of watching. The mounds were not random. The low flat ones, the ones where the openings sat just above ground level 8 or 10 inches high, had grass bending toward them when the wind blew. Bending in, the tall steep ones, the ones with openings 2 or 3 feet up, had grass bending away. Bending out, air was moving into the low mounds. Air was moving out of the tall ones. She sat with this for a long time. She watched it happen. She stood up and walked to the nearest low mound and held her hand flat near the opening and felt a slight cool movement of air being drawn into the earth. She walked to a tall mound and held her hand near its opening and felt air coming out. The colony was breathing, not any individual animal, the whole system. The difference in height between the two kinds of openings created a pressure difference, and that pressure difference moved air through the tunnels in one continuous flow, in through the low entrances, through the underground corridors, out through the tall ones. Not wind, not weather. Physics, the same physics that moves air through any two openings at different heights. Etta thought about her father's root cellar in Norway, where she had spent summer afternoons as a girl because it was the coolest place within walking distance of the farmhouse. She thought about the root cellar behind the house in Minnesota, where she had stored her preserves for 30 years, where the temperature never varied regardless of what the surface was doing. 52 degrees, summer, winter, did not matter. Below a certain depth, the earth did not know what the season was. The earth kept its own temperature maintained by its own mass, indifferent to the arguments happening at the surface. The prairie dogs had learned something. Or rather, they had arrived through whatever process animals arrive at things at a solution that used the Earth's indifference to winter as the fundamental fact of their survival strategy. They did not fight the cold. They went below it. Etta stood in the 90-degree heat of a Dakota August afternoon and felt something settle in her chest. Not hope exactly, certainty. The specific sensation of a mind that has been working a problem from the wrong direction, suddenly understanding which direction is right. She had been trying to figure out how to heat a broken house through a Dakota winter with insufficient fuel. That was the wrong problem. The right problem was different, smaller, more tractable. She did not need to heat a space that the winter could reach. She needed to live in a space the winter could not reach. The clay bluff behind the claim rose 60 feet from the valley floor, its south-facing slope baked hard by summer sun. Etta stood at its base the following morning with Arvid's mattock in her hands and a stick she had used to draw a rectangle in the dirt at her feet, 4 feet wide, 4.5 feet tall, just large enough to stand in with a slight hunch, just small enough for a 63-year-old woman to dig alone. She swung the mattock. Clay chips flew. The impact traveled up the handle into her palms, into her wrists, into her shoulders. She was 63 years old and she had not swung a mattock in 30 years, and her body registered this information clearly. She swung it again. More chips. A small pile beginning at her feet. By the end of the first day, she had a hole 3 feet deep into the hillside. Her hands were blistering where the handle had moved against skin that had forgotten this kind of work. Her shoulders burned with the specific burn of muscles used past their comfortable range. She stood in the small excavation and looked at the walls around her, at the clay surface 3 feet away, on either side at the solid mass of earth above her. Then she pressed her palm flat against the back wall of the hole. Cool. Not the cool of shade. The cool of depth. The cool of earth that had not been touched by the summer on the surface that existed in its own temperature regime 3 feet below the skin of things. Even in August, even with the surface baking at 90 degrees. She held her hand there for a long moment. Then she climbed out, picked up the mattock, and set it beside the growing pile of clay chips. Tomorrow she would dig further. Word moved through Buford, crossing the way word always moved through the store, through the church, through the chain of conversations that connected 12 families across 3 miles of Dakota grass into something that functioned like a community when it chose to. It moved because of Stellan. Etta had explained to the boy why they spent every day hauling clay in buckets from the hillside because Stellan was 8 years old, and 8-year-olds require explanation, or they generate their own, which is worse. She told him about the prairie dogs. She told him how they sealed their burrows before bad storms, how they could tell when the air was turning dangerous before any person could feel it. They know when the cold air is coming, she said. Air cold enough to freeze your lungs. Stellan, who was 8 and proud of his grandmother's knowledge, repeated this at the church gathering the following Sunday with the enthusiastic precision of a child who has memorized something important and wants credit for the memorization. By the time the story passed through 3 more mouths, Etta had become a woman who talked to animals and predicted catastrophic weather. The children started calling her Mole Woman. The adults used other words. Astrid Brandt Cormac's wife, the settlement's social arbiter in all informal matters, arrived at the claim in mid-September, ostensibly to check on Sigrid, who was still not fully present in the way that Sigrid had not been fully present since May. What she actually came to see was the tunnel, which was now 30 feet into the hillside, properly shored with cottonwood poles at 10-foot intervals, beginning to branch into the side chambers as Etta had planned through July. Astrid inspected the entrance with the expression of a woman who has already decided what she thinks and is now looking for confirmation. This is what you're doing, she said. It was not a question. Instead of preparing for winter, instead of caring for your daughter, digging holes. Preparing for winter, Etta said. She was standing at the tunnel entrance covered in clay dust, and she did not put down the bucket she was holding. This is a hole in the ground. It will be warmer than any house in this settlement come January, Etta said. Astrid's laugh was short and certain. You're taking survival advice from rodents. They survive winters that kill cattle, Etta said. They're animals, Astrid said. Animals live in dirt because they are animals. People build houses. People cut firewood. People don't crawl into hillsides because a ground squirrel suggested it. Etta said nothing. There was nothing she could say that would make a difference to what Astrid Brandt had already decided, and she understood this without bitterness, because she had lived 63 years and had learned the difference between conversations that can be changed by information and conversations that cannot. Astrid stepped closer. Her voice dropped. The church charity is for families who help themselves, she said, not for women who dig holes and tell children stories about magic air. If you want help this winter, you will fill in this pit and begin behaving sensibly. She paused. Otherwise, you will get nothing from us. She turned and walked away. That week, the small, informal assistance that had found its way to the claim, a neighbor's extra bread, a worn blanket someone had meant to throw away, stopped. Etta noticed its absence the way you noticed the absence of a sound you had grown accustomed to. She adjusted. $3.12 remained. The tunnel was 30 feet deep. 6 weeks until hard freeze. Stellan had developed a cough that she did not like the sound of, and the whole settlement had decided in the efficient way that small communities decide things that Etta Solvang was either touched in the head or too stubborn to save, and possibly both. She picked up the mattock. The days that followed had the quality of a fever dream compressed into a routine. Rise before dawn, feed Stellan, sit with Sigrid for a few minutes. She was eating more now, tracking movement with her eyes, sometimes calling Etta by the right name, then walk to the bluff and dig until her arms refused the motion. 40 feet, 50. The fire chamber carved out a shaft punched up through the clay to the surface. She lit a test fire and watched the smoke rise and disappear upward. The draft worked. She could feel air pulling upward through the shaft when she held her hand near the flames, the same principle as the prairie dog mounds just inverted. Air pulled in through the low entrance. Air exhaled upward through the high chimney shaft. The earth breathed if you gave it the right shape to breathe through. She found an old mercury thermometer in the abandoned schoolhouse and borrowed it without ceremony. She pressed it against the back wall of the tunnel, as far in as she had yet dug, 54 degrees, in August, while the surface baked at 90. She held the thermometer and looked at the number for a long time. Then she put it in her apron pocket and went back to digging because the number was not the destination. The finished tunnel was the destination, and it was not finished. October arrived cold. The first frost killed what remained of the kitchen garden. Stellan's cough worsened in the dry surface air. The sod house at night was a study in the failure of walls. The temperature inside tracked the temperature outside with a fidelity that made the distinction between in and out feel philosophical rather than practical. But 30 feet into the hillside, it was 54 degrees, and Etta Solvang kept digging. Because the numbers for the first time since May were beginning to work. Buford Crossing, Dakota Territory. October 1887. The collapse happened on a Tuesday. Etta was 45 feet into the hillside, hauling a bucket of clay back toward the entrance when she heard it. Not a loud sound. That was what surprised her afterward in the moments when she had enough distance from it to think. She had expected something dramatic, a roar, a crash, the sound of the earth making a decision about itself. What she heard instead was a grinding, a settling, a low crumble that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and then stopped. She dropped the bucket and moved toward the entrance as fast as the tunnel's dimensions allowed, which was not fast because the tunnel was 4.5 feet tall and she was moving in a crouch. She cleared the entrance and on-turned. A section of ceiling near the entrance, 6 feet of tunnel, the section she had shored last the section where the cottonwood poles had been set in ground that was slightly softer than the rest had come down. The poles had snapped. The clay had fallen in chunks the size of her head. The entrance passage was blocked. She stood at the edge of the collapse and waited for her heartbeat to slow. Then she did the calculation. If she had been 1 minute slower with the bucket, if she had stopped to rest in that section, as she sometimes did setting the bucket down and pressing her back against the wall, if Stellan had called for her and she had gone back to answer him instead of continuing it forward, the calculation produced a number she set aside because the number was not useful. What was useful was the assessment of what the collapse had cost and what it would take to address it. 3 days. That was what she estimated, standing at the blocked entrance on a Tuesday morning in October, with the first real cold of the season sharpening the air around her. 3 days to clear the debris, haul out the broken poles cut, and set new shoring in the damaged section. 3 days of work going backward instead of forward. 3 days closer to November, with nothing to show for the time, but returning to where she had been before Tuesday morning. She stood there for perhaps a minute, then she went to get the other bucket. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that is different from being tired. Tiredness is recoverable. You sleep, and the morning brings a version of yourself that is functional again. The other kind, the kind that sets in when you have been working past your limit for long enough that your limit has moved, that kind does not recover with sleep. It accumulates. It lives in the joints and the base of the skull, and the place behind the eyes where the decisions are made, and it colors everything it touches. By November, Etta Solvang was living in that exhaustion. She had dropped weight she had not had to spare. Her collarbones stood out in a way they had not stood out since the lean year in Minnesota when the crop failed, and they lived on stored beans and pride for 4 months. Her hands had passed through blistering and bleeding, and the breaking of blisters and the reforming of blisters, and had arrived at something tougher, less like skin and more like the material the work required. She had worn through the rags she had wrapped them in, and had cut strips from her second-best dress, and those had soaked through, and she had cut more. She ate 1 full meal a day. She gave Stellan and Sigrid 2. On the days she forgot to eat at all, and there were days she did not notice until she stood up too quickly, and the world went gray and narrow at the edges, and she had to hold the tunnel wall until it came back. Then she would eat something crackers, a handful of dried beans from the pantry shelf she had cut into the tunnel wall, whatever was immediately available, and the world would widen again and she would continue. She did not consider stopping. Not because she was incapable of considering it, because she had run the calculation from every angle available to her, and the calculation produced the same answer every time. The sod house on the surface would not sustain them through a Dakota winter. The store was closed to credit. The church charity had been withdrawn. There was nothing on the surface that would serve them. There was only the tunnel, 70 feet by early November, properly shored throughout. The fire chamber, fully excavated, the chimney shaft punched through 12 feet of clay to the surface. 3 sleeping alcoves roughed in along the side walls cut directly into the clay, each large enough for a straw tick mattress in one body. The pantry shelf running along the east wall of the main corridor, its clay surface holding the constant temperature that had not varied since August. She pressed the thermometer against the back wall on a November morning. 52 degrees. The surface outside was at 23. The difference between those two numbers was the difference between the tunnel and everything else. And standing in the back of that tunnel with a thermometer in her clay-caked hand and the smell of earth all around her and the silence of depth pressing against her ears, Etta Solvang understood that the calculation had finally changed. It was still going to be hard, but it was going to work. Hilda Thorvald appeared at the tunnel entrance on a morning in mid-November, when the first hard frost had laid itself across the grass and the Missouri River had taken on the slow, dark quality of water beginning to consider ice. She was 54 years old, a widow who had outlasted a husband and 2 children and 8 Dakota winters through some combination of physical constitution and the particular stubbornness of people who have already survived the worst thing and have nothing left to fear from lesser things. She was not kind, exactly. She was not cruel. In Buford Crossing, the distance between those two things was wider than it sounds, and Hilda Thorvald occupied the space between them with a directness that some people found uncomfortable and Etta had always respected. She arrived carrying a bundle, a heavy wool blanket, a sack of dried apples, a small jar of rendered lard. She set the bundle on the ground at the tunnel entrance and looked at it and then at Etta with the expression of a woman completing a transaction she has been deliberating about for some time. "I owe your son-in-law for mending my fence last spring," she said. "He did it without being asked and wouldn't take payment. This squares the debt." Etta looked at the blanket. The wool alone was worth more than everything she had left in the way of money. "Thank you," she said. Hilda did not leave. She stood at the tunnel entrance and looked into the darkness beyond the first few feet, where the lantern light Etta had hung inside cast an orange circle that didn't reach the first shoring pole. She looked at it the way she looked at most things long enough to actually write it, not just to confirm what she had already decided about it. "Can I see inside?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was the statement of someone who has made a decision and is announcing it rather than requesting permission. Etta took the lantern from its hook and let her in. They walked without speaking. Etta moved forward with the ease of someone who has made this passage hundreds of times, who knows where the ceiling dips slightly at the 20-foot mark, who knows to shift left at the entrance to the first sleeping alcove to avoid the shoring pole that sits 3 inches further into the corridor than it should. Hilda walked behind her, slower, one hand touching the wall. At the fire chamber, Etta paused. A small fire burned there, the kind she kept going through the day for light and warmth rather than cooking cottonwood pieces the size of her fist arranged for duration rather than heat. The smoke rose obediently up the chimney shaft and vanished. The air in the chamber was still, warm in the way of enclosed spaces with a fire rather than the aggressive warmth of a stove pushing against cold air. Hilda looked at the chimney shaft, at the ventilation opening cut into the opposite wall near the floor, at the way the 2 openings worked together to move air through the space without allowing the cold to drive in from outside. She said nothing yet. Etta led her further, past the sleeping alcoves, past the pantry shelf with its meager supplies arranged in the careful order of someone managing scarcity, to the back wall of the tunnel, 70 feet from the entrance, where the clay surface had the particular smooth darkness of earth that has never been touched by weather. Hilda put her hand on the wall. She left it there. The seconds passed. The fire crackled faintly at the other end of the tunnel. Outside, Etta could hear, or imagined, she could hear the November wind moving across the surface of the bluff 60 feet above them. Down here, nothing moved. The air sat in the space the tunnel had given it and stayed. 52 degrees, Etta said. It hasn't changed since August. Hilda kept her hand on the wall. My house is colder than this, she said, and I have a stove going. She was not saying it as a compliment exactly. She was saying it the way you say a thing that has surprised you and you are not yet certain what to do with the surprise. She took her hand from the wall and looked at the length of the tunnel behind her, at the chambers assuring the fire, the ventilation at the full 70 feet of what a 63-year-old woman had built alone with a mattock and buckets and hands that bled. She stood with it for a long time in the way that honest people stand with evidence that contradicts what they had expected to find. I still think you're wrong, she said finally. Etta waited. But I thought you should know. Hilda looked at the wall one more time. I hope you're not. Then she walked back toward the entrance without further comment, and Etta followed, and they emerged into the November cold, and Hilda picked up her bundle and set it inside the tunnel entrance and walked away in the direction of her own claim without looking back. Etta stood at the entrance and watched her go. Then she went back inside because the second sleeping alcove needed another foot of depth, and there was not enough November left to be generous with the hours. December came and the tunnel was finished. 75 feet of main corridor shored every 10 feet with cottonwood poles. The fire chamber with its working draft tested and confirmed. 3 sleeping alcoves cut into the side walls, each holding a straw tick mattress that Etta had hauled from the sod house on a makeshift sled in 2 trips. The pantry shelf with its supplies arranged at constant temperature, 40 pounds of flour, 15 pounds of beans, a small quantity of salt pork, the dried apples from Hilda. The 2 openings at different heights that moved air through the system even when the wind on the surface died, because the temperature difference between the tunnel air and the surface air created its own pressure differential. Etta moved Sigrid into the tunnel on a gray December morning, dragging her on the same makeshift sled because Sigrid could walk but not through the snow and not the distance required. Sigrid did not resist. Sigrid barely noticed, which was its own kind of information about where she still was in the geography of grief. Stellan thought the tunnel was the best thing that had ever happened to him in his 8 years of existence. He ran its full length 3 times on the first day, touching every surface, investigating every alcove, asking questions about the chimney shaft and the ventilation opening with the relentless specificity of a child encountering a system he wants to fully understand. His cough in the still warm air of the tunnel quieted. Etta noted this without commenting on it. Some things are better observed than announced. January arrived warm. This was not a comfort. Etta understood this immediately in the bone-deep way of someone who has been paying attention to the land for long enough to know that unseasonal warmth in Dakota is not a gift. It is a preparation, the earth storing up what the sky is about to spend. The first 12 days of January 1888 brought temperatures that belonged in April. 40 degrees, 50, snow melted, roads turned to mud, children walked to school without their coats. Farmers worked in their shirt sleeves and talked about the mild winter and what a relief it was. Cormac Brandt was heard at the store more than once observing that the Solvang woman had spent all autumn digging a hole, and look, they were not even going to need extra firewood this year. The observation traveled. These things always did. Astrid Brandt made a point of passing the claim and remarking to her companion loudly enough to be heard that all that work for nothing was a hard lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. And did the old woman know yet that she'd made a fool of herself in front of the whole settlement? Etta heard these things in the way that news travels in small communities, through the secondary sources of neighbors who thought she should know. She registered them the way she registered most things, noting, not concluding. She walked to the prairie dog town on the 8th of January. She had made this walk a dozen times since August because the prairie dogs had become in her mind not just the origin of the idea, but a kind of ongoing consultation. The original observation had led her to the tunnel, but she had come to understand through repeated visits that what the prairie dogs knew was not a static thing. It updated. It responded to conditions. They were not simply animals that lived underground. They were animals that read the land continuously and adjusted their behavior to what they read. She walked to the town on the 8th of January and stood at its edge and looked. Every entrance was sealed, not just closed sealed. Each low mound and each tall mound had been packed over with fresh earth pressed down and smooth and visible at a distance and unmistakable up close. She walked the perimeter of the town and checked every entrance she could find. Every one. There was no movement anywhere, no animals above ground, no bark chirps, no activity of any kind. The town had closed itself completely and without apparent exception and sat under the January sky like a field with slightly unusual topography. She had watched these animals for 5 months. She had never seen them do this. She stood at the edge of the sealed town and felt something move through her that she did not have a precise name for. It was not fear exactly. It was the sensation of receiving information from a source you have learned to trust and understanding that the information is serious. Something was coming. Something the prairie dogs had decided required every entrance sealed and every animal below ground, which was a level of response she had not previously observed for any storm or cold snap or change in weather. She walked back to the claim at a pace that her 63-year-old body registered as faster than comfortable, and her mind registered as not fast enough. She moved the last of the useful items from the sod house into the tunnel, the remaining lamp oil, the spare blankets, the small box of her husband's papers that Sigrid had kept by her bed, which Etta took without asking because she understood that in the event of what was coming, the papers being safe would matter more to Sigrid than the asking. She sealed the sod house door with packed clay and canvas. She stacked additional firewood inside the tunnel entrance, not for heat, not for the tunnel, which did not need heating, but for cooking and for light and for the particular comfort of visible fire when the world outside becomes something other than the world you recognize. Stellan found her working and stood watching with the attentive patience of a child who has learned that when his grandmother moves with this particular quality of purpose, questions can wait. "Why are we moving everything inside?" he asked when she paused. "Because the prairie dogs sealed their town this morning," she said. "Every entrance, nothing outside, nothing visible. They have never done that before." Stellan considered this. "So something bad is coming." "Yes." How bad? Etta looked at the sky, which was blue and clear and entirely unrevealing. "I don't know," she said. "Bad enough that they decided not to take any chances." She went back to work. Stellan, after a moment, went to get the smaller bucket and began helping without being asked. The morning of January 12th began as the previous 11 mornings had begun. Clear sky, soft air, the particular stillness of a landscape that has been enjoying weather too mild for the season and has not yet been told that the arrangement is over. Etta rose before dawn, built the fire in the chamber to its daily working temperature, checked the draft, checked the ventilation flow, walked the length of the tunnel with her hand trailing along the wall. Everything as it should be. The thermometer against the back wall read 52 degrees, the same as August, the same as October, the same as every morning since she had first pushed the thermometer against the clay 3 feet in and understood what she was dealing with. After breakfast, she climbed to the top of the bluff. She did this sometimes. The climb was not easy at her age, and she did not do it for pleasure exactly, but for the view it provided that was unavailable from the valley floor. From the top of the bluff, you could see north and west for a distance that made the settlement look very small and the sky very large, which was usually information she found useful. She stood at the top in the mild January air and looked northwest. The horizon was dark. Not the darkness of clouds, which she knew. Clouds have edges that move in the way that water moves in curves and gradients changing as you watch. This darkness was different. It was a wall, vertical, definite, extending from one edge of the visible horizon to the other, and it was moving. Moving faster than she had words for. Moving the way she imagined the front of a wave moves before it reaches shore, except this was not water. This was a darkness that was swallowing the sky from the ground up, consuming the blue above it as it advanced, boiling at its leading edge, with a violence that she could see but not yet hear. Hawks were moving ahead of it, not circling, fleeing, straight southeast fast, every bird she could see going in the same direction with the urgency of things that know what is behind them. She turned and moved toward the tunnel entrance. Not running exactly. Her knee did not allow running on the descent, which she knew, and she had learned the difference between urgent and careless in 63 years of managing situations. She moved as fast as the terrain allowed, and the careful part of her brain kept track of each step, while the rest of it tracked the wall on the horizon, which was growing as she descended, which was filling more of the sky every time she looked up. She was 50 feet from the tunnel entrance when the wind arrived. It did not build. It was not there, and then it was there instantly, completely, as if the air had been replaced between one breath and the next. Cold like she had not felt cold, not the cold of winter mornings or frozen river air, or the cold of the hard winter of 1873 that had killed livestock across the territory. This was cold with force behind it. Cold that was not merely temperature, but impact driving something that was not quite snow, finer than anything into every exposed surface with a searing abrasion that her mind initially refused to categorize as cold because it felt more like heat. She could not see her hand in front of her face. She knew the direction to the tunnel entrance because she had walked it 100 times, and her body knew the angle of the slope and the feel of the ground under her feet, and she kept moving on that knowledge because her eyes were no longer providing useful information. 20 feet, she estimated. She counted steps. The wind screamed in a register she had not known wind could reach, a sustained note that was less like sound and more like pressure. Her lips split. She tasted blood. 10 feet. The ground sloped down here. She knew this slope. She had dug out this slope herself, the access cut she had made in September to allow easier entry. Her shoulder hit the canvas she had hung over the entrance. She grabbed it and pulled and fell through, tumbling into the darkness of the access corridor, landing on her hands and knees on the clay floor. Behind her, the canvas whipped inward and outward with the violence of something caught between two forces. She reached back and grabbed the timber barricade she had built and placed beside the entrance for exactly this possibility, and she hauled it into position and wedged it against the frame. Not airtight. The frame would not allow airtight, but blocking the direct blast, redirecting the force, giving the corridor behind it a chance to be something other than an extension of what was outside. The sound changed. The wall of noise outside reduced to something muffled, lower present, but no longer immediate. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear her heart. She could hear the canvas still fighting the wind at the edges of the barricade where it was not perfectly sealed. She crawled forward, feeling the temperature change with each foot she moved into the tunnel. The cold that had come in behind her dissipating, replaced by the steady 52 degrees that the earth maintained regardless of what the surface was doing. Warmer, warmer, the clay walls giving back the temperature they had held since summer. Etta, Stellan's voice from deeper in the tunnel, small, scared in the way children are scared when they understand that the adult they trust is the only barrier between them and something large. "I'm here," she said. She kept crawling toward his voice, one hand on the wall, the temperature around her continuing to steady and settle into what the earth had been holding all along. 52 degrees, the same as August, the same as the prairie dog town sealed above her on the surface, every entrance packed and invisible, every animal below the frost line, where the temperature did not know what the season was. Outside, the wind screamed at a pitch that had no winter she had experienced in 63 years. Inside, the tunnel held its temperature. And Etta Solvang moved toward her grandson's voice in the darkness, one hand on the clay wall, and understood that everything she had built through 4 months of exhaustion and ridicule and bleeding hands had arrived at its moment. It would work or it would not. She had built it as well as she knew how. The earth would hold what the earth held, and the rest was already decided. Buford Crossing, Dakota Territory. January 12, 1888. Night. The world above had become something that did not have a name in any language Etta Solvang knew. She understood this from the sound, not from what she could see, because there was nothing to see. The tunnel entrance was sealed behind its timber barricade, and the canvas and the darkness inside was absolute, except for the small orange circle of the fire at the chamber 30 feet in. She understood it from the sound the wind made against the bluff, which was not the sound of wind she had known in 63 years of living in cold climates. It was sustained in a way that weather is not usually sustained. Most storms pulse, rise, and fall, take breath. This one had no breath. It was a single continuous exhalation from something vast, impatient, that had been waiting for exactly this moment and intended to make full use of it. She sat by the fire and listened, and measured the storm by its sound, the way a ship's captain measures distance from shore by the echo of the foghorn. Stellan slept. This was the most significant thing she knew about the tunnel's performance in its first hours, and she held it as evidence the way she held the thermometer reading specifically measurably. The boy had fallen asleep with his back against the clay wall of the sleeping alcove, and his grandmother's wool coat pulled over him, and his breathing had the slow regularity of genuine sleep, not the shallow unconscious of exhaustion. His cough, which had been worsening through October and November in the dry cold of the sod house, had quieted in the constant warmth of the tunnel air. The still moist warmth of enclosed earth was better for small lungs than anything the surface had offered him. Sigrid had done something that evening that Edda had not seen her do since May. She had sat up. Not just in the physical sense, though, that was itself significant. She had sat upright in the sleeping alcove and taken Stellan's hand when he came to her, and she had held it, and her eyes had tracked the movement of the fire with the attention of someone who was present rather than merely occupying a body. Something in the constancy of the tunnel, the unchanging temperature, the stillness of the air, the absence of the howling variability of the surface world had reached some part of her that the sod house had not been able to reach. Edda watched her daughter and did not remark on it because some things are diminished by being named before they are ready. She built the fire to its steady working size and set a pot of beans over it and listened to the storm work on the bluff above her and thought about the prairie dogs in their sealed town 40 feet overhead and felt something close to kinship with them. They had known. They had sealed their town 3 days before the storm arrived, when the surface gave no sign of what was coming, when the sky was clear and the temperature was mild, and the whole settlement of Buford Crossing was congratulating itself on the easiest January in recent memory. They had sealed it because they were reading something that the surface did not show. Some pressure, some quality of air, some information that arrived through channels a human nervous system was not calibrated to receive. She had learned to read what they read. Not directly, she did not have their instruments. But she had learned to read them, which was close enough. The beans came to a slow boil. She reduced the fire and let them simmer. Outside, the thermometer she had left at the tunnel entrance before barricading it, a decision she had made in September when she built the barricade system to understand what was happening at the boundary between inside and outside, read whatever it read. She would not know until morning. But she could feel the boundary. She could feel in the way you feel the edge of warmth from a fire where the tunnel's protection ended and the outside began. The barricade was not airtight. Cold came through the gaps, entered the access corridor, moved perhaps 10 feet before the earth absorbed it. Past that 10 feet, 52 degrees, unchanged. The voice came in the night. Edda had dozed at the fire, sitting upright with her back against the clay wall the way she had learned to rest during the months of digging when lying down felt like surrender. Exhaustion had finally found the level where it could not be refused, and she had slept in the thin, partial way of someone who remains even in sleep, aware of the space around them. The voice woke her, faint, coming from the direction of the barricade, barely audible through the sustained roar of the storm. A woman's voice. Words she could not make out, but the shape of the sounds was clear, the particular shape of someone calling out when they are not certain anyone can hear them. Edda was at the barricade in 20 seconds. She pressed her ear against the timber and listened. Please, anyone. She recognized the voice. She did not allow herself to think about what recognizing it meant, about what it meant that Hilda Thorvald was outside in this at what she estimated was midnight or later, about what condition a person would be in after being outside in this for any duration at all. She thought about the rope she had anchored to a shoring pole near the entrance in October, when she had first thought through what the tunnel might be asked to do beyond sheltering her own family. 50 feet of hemp cord coiled on a wooden peg she had driven into the clay wall. She took it down. She tied one end around her waist with the knot her husband had taught her, the knot that holds under load and releases cleanly when you pull the right end, which she had practiced until she could do it in the dark, because she had understood in October that if this knot ever mattered, it would matter in the dark. She braced herself. She shoved aside the barricade. The cold was not comparable to cold she had experienced before. She understood this in the first second, which was all the time her body needed to register the information. 40 below, perhaps colder, the wind had not stopped, and the temperature had been falling for 12 hours. And wherever it had started, the falling, it had continued past every point she had a reference for. The ice dust drove horizontally at a speed that made the act of breathing a negotiation rather than a reflex. She pulled the scarf she had wrapped around her face before opening the barricade up over her nose and breathed through the wool, and the wool was not adequate, but it was better than nothing. She could not see. She knew the tunnel entrance. She knew the access slope. Beyond that, the world was white and gray in absolute a condition rather than a landscape, the removal of visual information in favor of wind and cold, in the particular howling note that had been the storm's voice for the past hours. She moved toward the sound. The rope paid out behind her. She counted steps 5, 10, and called out in a voice that the wind took immediately and redistributed somewhere she could not predict. 15 feet from the entrance, her foot found something soft. Hilda Thorvald lay on the frozen ground with her coat covered in frost and her face the color of candle wax, where it was not darkened by frostbite along the cheekbones and the bridge of her nose. Her eyes were open. They moved when Etta crouched over her, tracked Etta's face with the slow, effortful attention of someone using the last of a resource. "You found me," Hilda said, or something with that shape. The wind made the words approximate. Etta got her hands under Hilda's arms. Hilda was a full-grown woman, and she was dead weight, her legs not responding, her body having spent whatever it had on the walking that had brought her here. Etta pulled. Her feet slipped on the frozen ground. She pulled again and moved Hilda 6 inches. Then again. The rope was taut behind her, angling back toward the entrance, and she used it as a line not to pull herself but to maintain her sense of direction in the white-gray erasure of everything. She leaned down close to Hilda's ear. "You have to try," she said. "Anything. Whatever you have." Something moved in Hilda's legs. Not walking, a pushing, a shove of whatever remained against the frozen ground. 6 inches became a foot, became 3 feet, became the distance between dying and not dying, as Etta pulled and Hilda pushed, and the rope shortened between them, and the tunnel entrance grew from invisible to barely visible to close. They went through the canvas together. Etta wedged the barricade back into place with one arm, while holding Hilda upright with the other, and then the sound of the storm reduced to its muffled roar, and they were inside, and the temperature began its immediate change, the earth giving back what it held, 52 degrees, pressing in from the walls. She dragged Hilda to the fire chamber. Hilda's feet were the worst. Etta removed the frozen boots, the leather had gone stiff as wood, and looked at what was there. White, waxy, hard in the way that flesh is not meant to be hard. 2 toes on the right foot were already darkening toward the blue-black of tissue that has been without circulation long enough to be making decisions about its future. She remembered what her father had said about frostbite working on a neighbor's hands when she was a girl in Norway. "Don't warm it fast, warm it slow. Fast warming ruptures the vessels. Slow warming gives them a chance." She took the jar of lard that Hilda herself had brought in November, the basa that sat on the pantry shelf at constant temperature, and she packed it around Hilda's feet, cool and soft, not warm, just above freezing, not the temperature the feet needed to reach, but the first step toward it, allowing the tissue to thaw at a rate that gave it a chance rather than a certainty. Hilda's eyes focused on her face. "I told you it was a hole for dead people," she said. Her voice was a cracked whisper, the voice of someone whose throat had been breathing ice-dust air for hours. Etta said, "You're welcome." Something came out of Hilda's chest that might have been a laugh or might have been a sip. In the firelight, it was hard to distinguish, and Etta did not try. She kept working on the feet, kept the lard applied, kept the temperature rising by the slowest possible increments, and listened to Hilda breathe. "My house," Hilda said after a while. "The north wall." Etta waited. The wind came through. Hilda's voice was getting stronger, which was information. The warmth restoring what cold had spent. The north wall just came down. One side of the structure simply yielding to what had been pressing against it for hours. She had gotten out through the gap and walked, following the bluffs. She could feel them even when she couldn't see. She knew the Solvang claim was somewhere along this line of bluffs, and she had walked until she couldn't walk anymore. "I thought I was going to die out there," she said. I could feel it happening. Not all at once, just less and less of me available for the walking. Etta said nothing, and all I could think about, Hilda said, was that stupid woman in her stupid prairie dog tunnel. Etta looked at her. "I should have told people," Hilda said. "When I put my hand on the wall in November, I should have said something." She paused. "I was still so certain you were wrong." "You're alive," Etta said. "That is what matters right now." Leif Haas arrived next. Etta heard him before she reached the barricade. A different sound from Hilda's voice, heavier, less controlled, the sound of a large man who has been running or something close to it and has arrived somewhere and is not certain where. She opened the barricade 4 inches and called out. He found the entrance by her voice and came through in a controlled fall, a big man folding himself through the canvas and the barricade and landing on his hands and knees on the access floor. He was shaking so badly his coat moved with it, a continuous vibration that his body had apparently been maintaining for some time as its primary available response to the temperature. His roof, he told her when he could form words. The entire thing. He had dug himself out of the debris and gone outside and seen briefly before the white-gray erasure of the storm closed over everything, a line of smoke rising from somewhere along the bluffs. He had moved toward it. He had not known whose it was. He had simply moved toward the only visible sign that anything was burning anywhere in that world. Eda's chimney shaft. 12 feet of clay, the smoke rising and being caught by the wind above the surface briefly visibly before dispersing. Visible enough for a man who had lost everything above ground to orient himself and walk. She brought him to the fire and gave him what she had. The Baki boys arrived holding hands. Eric was 11 and Martin was 9, and they came through the barricade together in the way that children who are afraid move together, maintaining contact as if separation is another kind of danger on top of all the others. Their parents had sent them out when the family stove failed in the wooden structure that had been their home, which was burning itself alive, trying to compensate for what the storm was pulling away from it faster than fire could replace. Find the Solvang place, their father had said, half a mile along the bluffs. The half mile had become longer in the whiteout. The boys had walked it and more following the bluffs because there was nothing else to follow, holding each other's hands until they stumbled against the barricade and Etta heard them and opened it. She asked where their parents were. They were going to follow us, Eric said, after they tried the stove one more time. Etta wrapped them in blankets without responding to what Eric had said, because there was nothing to say that would serve them. The boys sat together by the fire and looked at the flames and held hands and did not speak. Some part of them already understood the arithmetic of what following us after one more try at the stove meant in the conditions outside. She let them hold what they knew at the pace they were capable of holding it. Pastor Halvard came last near what she estimated was dawn, though underground there was no dawn, and the only evidence was a slight, almost imperceptible reduction in the quality of the roaring outside, not stopping, but changing, as if the storm had shifted some of its weight to a different foot. He had been moving between homesteads when the storm arrived, checking on his scattered congregation in the way that pastors in isolated settlements check on scattered congregations on foot alone, covering ground that can only be covered on foot because horses are sometimes less reliable than legs in difficult conditions. The wind had found him in the open and spun him until he lost his cardinal directions, and he had walked in circles for an indeterminate number of hours, slowly losing the battle that his body was waging against the temperature until his foot found the base of the bluffs and he felt his way along them. He came through the barricade already praying or finishing a prayer, the words arriving in fragments ahead of his body. He stood in the access corridor and the temperature changed around him and he stopped speaking. He made his way to the fire chamber and looked at the 8 people gathered there. Etta, Stellan, Sigrid, sitting upright against the wall with her eyes fully present. Hilda with her bandaged feet extended toward the fire. Leif Haas still shaking, but less the Baki boys with their hands intertwined in the firelight. I prayed for deliverance, he said finally. His voice was raw in the way of throats that have been breathing ice dust for hours. And the Lord delivered me to a hole in the ground dug by an old woman. He paused. The Lord has a sense of humor, he said. 9 people in a space designed for 8 to 10. The sleeping chambers fit 2 each, so they rotated some resting while others sat by the fire. The same fire that Etta had built to working temperature that morning and maintained through the day, small, steady pieces rather than large, dramatic ones because the goal was duration, not peak heat. She rationed the food without announcing she was rationing it. Small portions once a day in a sequence that made it seem like the meal was simply what the meal was rather than the calculation it was. 40 pounds of flour and 15 pounds of beans and the salt pork and Hilda's dried apples divided among 9 people for a duration she could not predict required a certain arithmetic that she performed continuously in the back of her mind without sharing the numbers. Hilda's feet were the ongoing concern. The 2 blackening toes had not improved by the second day, which Etta had not expected them to. What she had hoped for, and what she observed with the same careful attention she gave everything, was that the rest of the foot was responding to the slow warming. The tissue was not progressing in its damage. The lard and the warmth and the stillness were buying time, if not resolution. Time was what she could offer. Resolution required a doctor, and a doctor was 3 miles away and inaccessible for the duration of whatever this was. She told Hilda this directly because Hilda was a woman who deserved direct information. Hilda looked at her feet with the expression of a person conducting an honest assessment of something they cannot change. 2 toes, she said. Probably, Etta said. She's quiet for a moment. Then I've survived worse. Etta said, I know you have. The storm broke on the second day. Not with drama, without drama, which was its own kind of statement. The absence of announcement that had characterized its arrival reversed itself, and the wind simply began to be less than it had been, and then less than that, and then the roaring outside the barricade reduced to something that had the texture of ordinary wind, rather than the texture of something categorical. Etta heard the change from inside the fire chamber. She waited an hour because rushing toward the opening of a barricade after a Dakota blizzard is how you discover that the storm has paused rather than ended, which is a discovery best made with the barricade intact rather than dismantled. Then she moved the timber aside and pushed the canvas open and stepped outside. The world had ended. That was her first thought standing at the tunnel entrance in the gray January morning. The world she had known was simply gone, and a different world had been placed in its position, one that operated entirely on the color white and the concept of silence. The sod house was invisible. A drift taller than she was had built against its south wall and curved over its roof, making it a shape in the landscape rather than a structure identifiable only by its location relative to the bluff. The path to the river had been erased. The ground between the tunnel entrance and the nearest fence post was a single unbroken plain of packed snow that bore no relationship to the topography beneath it. The prairie dog town to the north was a white field. The sky was clear, blue in the specific pale shade of sky after a storm that has spent all of itself. The sun sat low on the horizon with the quality of winter sun in the northern plains, light without warmth, presence without effect, illuminating everything and changing nothing. The temperature was still 40 below. But without wind, 40 below was a different proposition than 40 below with wind. She could breathe. She could stand upright. She could look across the valley and see the shapes of other homesteads in the distance, or the places where other homesteads had been, which was not always the same thing. No smoke rose from any chimney she could see. She climbed to the top of the bluff, which took longer than it usually did, because the surface of the slope had changed overnight into something that required attention to each step. From the top, she looked out across the valley. The settlement of Buford Crossing, 3 miles away, was a smudge in the frozen distance. Individual structures were indistinguishable. Behind her from the tunnel entrance, cut into the hillside, a thin plume of steam rose and dissolved in the cold air. Warm air meeting cold, condensing visible for a moment before the dry cold of the atmosphere absorbed it. Her chimney was working, her fire was burning, her tunnel held what it held. She stood on the bluff in the 40 below January morning and looked at the valley and understood that the questions she had carried since August, will it work, had been answered. What remained were the other questions, the ones that the answer to the first question made possible to ask. She went back down. Pastor Halvard made the walk to Buford Crossing 3 days after the storm broke, when the temperature had risen enough to make 3 miles survivable, and the drifts along the high ground had consolidated enough to walk on rather than through. He told them about the tunnel. He told them about the 63-year-old woman who had dug 75 feet into a clay bluff with a mattock and buckets because she watched prairie dogs. He told them about the 9 people who had been inside when the storm arrived, and the 9 people who were inside when the storm ended, which was the same number and not the number that could have been reported. He told them about 52 degrees inside while the surface temperature reached 47 below. He told them about the fire that burned steadily for 2 days, its smoke rising through a clay chimney shaft, visible from the surface, the thread of smoke that Leif Haas had followed to the entrance. They did not believe him at first. Then they walked out to sea. They came in groups over the following week as the roads became passable, and the shock of the storm's aftermath gave way to the particular human need to understand what had happened and why. They ducked through the entrance canvas and walked the 75 feet to the back wall, and they put their hands on the clay and felt the temperature that had not changed while the world above them had become something that killed. Hilda Thorvald, sitting in the fire chamber with her bandaged feet extended toward the warmth, told anyone who asked that she had come to the tunnel in November and put her hand on the wall and felt 52 degrees and still not believed it would hold. I was wrong, she said. She said it without qualification, without the hedging that most people apply to being wrong. She said it the way honest people say things that cost them something. Leif Haas explained the ventilation to people who asked about the draft, how two openings at different heights moved air through the system, the same principle as the prairie dog mounds, working even when the wind died because the temperature difference between tunnel air and surface air created its own pressure differential. He had understood it by the second day sitting by the fire and watching the smoke rise through the shaft, thinking about the physics of it, the way a man thinks about a thing when he has time and the thing has proven itself. The Baki boys did not speak much. They sat with what they knew about their parents in the way children sit with things too large for the containers available to them. Pastor Halvard spent time with them. It was not enough. It was what there was. Cormac Brandt came on the 10th day. Etta was in the fire chamber when he arrived, cooking the last of the beans for the Baki boys who were still in the tunnel because there was nowhere else for them to be yet, and she had not been able to bring herself to send them to the cold of the surface while the temperature held where it held. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of a large man making his way through the tunnel with the careful deliberateness of someone in an unfamiliar space, his hand on the wall, his steps measured. He appeared in the firelight. He was wearing everything he owned, she estimated, and his face had the particular quality of a man who has been through something and has not yet finished processing what that something was. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the Baki boys. He looked at the fire. He looked at the chimney shaft, at the ventilation opening at the pantry shelf. Then he walked past her toward the back of the tunnel. She heard his footsteps recede, the sound of a man walking the full length of 75 feet and stopping at the end, the silence of a man standing with his hand on a clay wall, then the footsteps returning. He came back into the firelight and looked at the Baki boys again. Martin, the younger one, was asleep with his head on his brother's shoulder. Eric was awake, looking at the fire. He looked at Stellan, who sat beside them, wrapped in the wool coat, pink-cheeked, in the warmth alive. "I said you would find him frozen in here," Brandt said. His voice was not the voice he used in the store. It was the voice underneath that one. Etta waited. He looked at the boy for a long moment. "I was wrong," he said. He said it the way he did most things, directly, without ornamentation, as if the statement was complete in itself and did not require additions. He was not a man who apologized, and this was not an apology. It was something more specific than an apology. It was a correction. A man of 11 Dakota winners correcting the record on a matter of survival, which for Cormac Brandt was the only domain that ultimately mattered. He looked at her. "You should write down how you built this," he said. "Measurements, depth, width, where to put the openings, how high the tall shaft, how low the entrance, materials, all of it. Other people should know." "I already have," Etta said. She had written it in November in the journal she had kept since the death of her husband, the measurements, the shoring intervals, the ventilation principle, the fire chamber placement, the chimney shaft dimensions, the sleeping alcove sizes. She had written it in English because her English was better than her Norwegian for measurements and technical description, and she had drawn diagrams in the margins with the stub of a pencil she had sharpened 17 times. Brandt nodded slowly. "I'll put copies in the store," he said. "People can take them." He looked around the tunnel one more time. At the clay walls that had held their temperature through the worst storm in living memory in this territory, at the fire that had burned for 2 days on wood she had stored against exactly this, at the ventilation shaft that had drawn correctly even in 50-mile-per-hour winds because the physics of it did not depend on weather cooperating. "Your family has credit at the store," he said. "Whatever you need to get through the rest of winter. We'll settle in the spring." He turned and walked back toward the entrance. Etta watched him go. She thought about August, about standing at his counter in her good dress with the mud stains from the funeral, watching him close his ledger, about the 3 miles home in the August heat, counting steps to keep from counting other things, about the calculation that had no solution on the surface and the solution she had found by going below it. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt the specific weight of what the past 10 days had established, that some people who should have been alive were not, and some people who should not have been alive were sitting by her fire eating her beans, and the weight of that was not something satisfaction could occupy at the same time. She felt the specific responsibility of having understood something that others had not, and the obligation that understanding carried forward. The copies appeared in Brandt's store that week. People took them. By spring, 3 families in the Buford Crossing area had begun excavating their own tunnel shelters into whatever bluffs or hillsides their claims offered. Hilda Thorvald, who had lost 2 toes from her right foot no more, which Etta considered a reasonable outcome, given the alternative, directed the construction of one into the bluff behind her rebuilt sod house from a chair, her bandaged foot elevated pointing with a stick at where the next shoring pole should go. Leif Haas dug into a hillside a quarter-mile from his new property and lined his tunnel with timber salvaged from his collapsed roof, which was now more useful underground than it had ever been above it. Word moved further than the settlement. A newspaper in Bismarck printed a short item about the woman who had dug a prairie dog tunnel and sheltered 9 people through the children's blizzard. Letters arrived. Etta answered each one in her careful English, drawing the diagrams again, explaining the ventilation principle, describing the thermometer readings from August through January, the proof she had accumulated before the storm that allowed her to trust the system when the storm arrived. She charged nothing. When people asked why, she said the prairie dogs didn't charge me. Sigrid recovered. Not quickly, not completely in any way that erased what May had taken from her, but the months in the tunnel and the constant temperature surrounded by the evidence that the world could be understood and that understanding it had consequences. Something in that had reached the part of her that grief had closed. By spring, she was rising before Etta most mornings. By summer, she had replanted the kitchen garden in the cleared ground beside the claim, working in the early hours before the heat of the day arrived, and Etta would come outside and find her there. And they would work together in the way that mothers and daughters who have survived something together work. Not talking much about the surviving, just working the shared knowledge between them, requiring no words because it was already in the hands and the back, and the particular way you move when you know the earth can be worked with rather than against. Stellan grew. He grew with the particular velocity of children who have made it through something early and have a certain quality of seriousness behind the ordinary childhood things that other children their age do not yet have. He told the story to every child he met with the precision of someone who has been told to get the details right because the details matter. The prairie dogs, the thermometer, the 2 kinds of openings, the 52 degrees. He drew the diagrams himself eventually from memory when people asked. Etta Solvang stood at the tunnel entrance on a morning in late March when the snow had begun its retreat from the south-facing slopes and the prairie grass was showing the first pale green of a season that intended to return. The tunnel entrance was still there. The timbers of the barricade framed the canvas flap she had replaced 3 times through the winter, the access slope she had dug in September, the clay walls that had held their temperature through the worst storm in the territory's recorded history. She put her hand on the wall just inside the entrance. 52 degrees. The same as August. The same as October. The same as the night 9 people sat around a small fire and listened to the world above them become something that did not have a name. The earth had not changed. That was the thing about the earth. It kept its temperature and its counsel and its indifference to the arguments happening at the surface. And it did not adjust itself to the expectations of the people living above it. It was simply what it was at the depth below which the season stopped meaning anything, and what it was had been enough. The prairie dog town on the rise to the north was stirring. She could see from the tunnel entrance the first movement above ground, the cautious emergence of animals checking whether the world above had returned to the conditions their species had agreed to operate in. They moved. They checked. They stayed. The world had returned. Etta stood at the entrance of what she had built and looked at the valley and thought about the people in it, the ones the storm had taken and the ones it had not taken, and the ones who were now digging into hillsides with mattocks because they had held her diagrams in their hands and understood what she had understood in August, looking at a prairie dog town in 90-degree heat. She thought about Brandt and his 11 winters and his missing fingers and the certainty that had organized his understanding of who could survive what and how evidence had moved that certainty, as evidence always moves certainty when it arrives with sufficient force. She thought about Hilda putting her hand on the back wall in November and saying, "I still think you're wrong, but I hope you're not," which was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in the entire duration of the building of the tunnel, and which she had carried as a companion through the months that followed. She did not think of herself as someone who had done something remarkable. She thought of herself as someone who had paid attention to what the prairie dogs knew and built what the paying attention required and maintained what she had built until it was needed. The earth doesn't know what season it is, she had told Stellan the night of the storm, when he had asked her from the darkness of the sleeping alcove whether they were safe. She had said, below the frost line, it's always the same. Winter doesn't reach down here. We're below where winter lives, he had said. How did you know that? She had said, the prairie dog showed me. He had been quiet for a moment. Then do you think they know we're here? She had thought about that, about the sealed town 40 feet above her head, the animals below their own frost line in their own tunnels, the two populations separated by 60 feet of clay, both alive in the same storm for the same reason. I think she had said that they know exactly what they're doing, and I think we learned just enough of it to stay alive. The fire had burned steadily. The temperature had held at 52 degrees. And above them the storm had spent itself on the surface of a world that neither the prairie dogs nor Etta Solvang had needed to be part of in order to survive it.